Next, we have the panel discussion titled Politics in a Changing South Asia. I would now like to invite the following distinguished panelists on stage. Professor Niraja Gopal Jayal, the Center for the Study of Law and Governance, Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar, Assistant Professor of Political Economy, National Institute of Pakistan Studies, Quaid-i-Azam University, Pakistan. Professor Amena Mohsin, Professor at the Department of International Relations, Dhaka University, Bangladesh. And Dr. Harinda Vidanage, Director at Bandaranaike Center for International Studies, Sri Lanka. I would also like to invite Professor C. Mohan, Director of ISAS, to join them and to chair the session.
Friends, we'll now come to the panel discussion. So we are running about 10 minutes late and with very strict instructions on taking it to, and we're also interspersed just before lunch. So it's going to be quite a tight session, but I think it's going to be worth it because we got 4 wonderful speakers from the region to speak about the politics of South Asia. We've heard a little while before, the minister today kicked off the discussion by talking about the challenges Singapore faces in maintaining, sustaining a multicultural, multi-religious society. And if you look at the subcontinent, of course, those problems are, of course, much larger, much more challenging. But it is also a period where in the subcontinent, the multiple identities today are clashing, and the mobilization of them by the political parties, by political institutions, has queered the pitch, and today has taken to a level where it is really, whether it leads to real disruption or not, it is really a deep crisis at one level in terms of the politics of the subcontinent. But yet we've known historically over the last India is one of the, subcontinent is one of the oldest civilizations. It has the resilience, it has dealt with a lot worse before. So in a sense, we got to be optimistic about the future of South Asia. And I think the key for us is therefore to understand what is the dynamic today that is unfolding in the subcontinent, because for Southeast Asia, for Singapore, for ASEAN, will need to pay increasingly more attention to the subcontinent. That because the larger disruption that is taking place in the world, as subcontinent today becomes the fastest growing economic region in the world, the importance, the weight, the salience of the subcontinent for the prosperity and stability of Southeast Asia, and more broadly East Asia, is only going to rise. The location of the subcontinent at the crossroads of Asia, between China and the Indian Ocean, between the Middle East and Southeast Asia, that what was called the crossroads was always seen as crossroads. Today, once again regains its prominence as a region that's going to shape the larger balance of power in Asia and beyond. And then we have the fact that the subcontinent, it was mentioned before, the diaspora, that's one of the focus areas for us. There are at least 40 million South Asians living abroad. 40 million. India alone has 22. We put everyone together. And as Mr. Moragada pointed out, the Prime Minister of Ireland, 4 ministers in Canadian cabinet, you see across the board today, the weight of the South Asian diaspora is has grown in the last many years, and that's going to be significant. So in multiple ways, what happens in South Asia is of consequence for Southeast Asia and East Asia. And I think one of the tasks of ISAS has been to be able to interpret what's happening in South Asia, bring it to a larger audience in Southeast Asia, and to build that bridge of understanding between South Asia and Southeast Asia. We got 4 wonderful speakers. Their bios are all with you. So what we're going to do is, we got an hour and 20 minutes, perhaps, till we have to close it at 1:15, 1:20. So each of you is going to speak for 15 minutes. And I'm sure one of them is going to make sure that you see the signboard saying you're running out of time. So stick to 15 minutes, and I think you can make those sharp points. I think we can look forward to a wonderful discussion, because we have 4 speakers from 4 corners of the subcontinent to speak about what is driving South Asia, how South Asia is changing. Please welcome the panel. Who is the first speaker? Yeah, Professor Niraja Gopal.
Thanks to Professor Raja Mohan and to ISAS for inviting me to this forum. Let me start with a cliche. In recent years, political change, not just in South Asia but across the world, from Europe east and west, from the Americas north and south, has been nothing short of breathtaking. And India is no exception. It too has been experiencing the winds, one might even say the headwinds of political change. For several decades before this, the catchphrase Indian exceptionalism was used to explain everything about Indian democracy that seemed inexplicable or unfamiliar in terms of the experiences of democracies in the global north. India was also considered unusual amongst the democracies of the global south, or at least amongst the countries of the global south, in having successfully sustained a vibrant democracy with a semi-literate electorate, high rates of poverty, and a society that was immensely diverse in terms of language, region, religion, caste, and tribe. The size of its electorate alone caused India to be described as the world's largest democracy, one characterized by mass participation, free and fair elections for the most part, a mostly robust record of civil liberties and free speech, a vigorous civil society, and above all, a reasonable record of managing diversity. In short, a chaotic, noisy, but thriving multicultural democracy. Today, India is in all of these respects a somewhat diminished democracy. On media integrity and civil society participation, India has been pronounced a backslider by the Global State of Democracy report that is produced by an intergovernmental organization called the International IDEA. Another large comparative data set, the 2018 Annual Democracy Report, prepared by the VDEM project, Varieties of Democracy project, has identified what it calls disquieting trends and a tendency towards autocratization in countries like India, Brazil, Poland, Russia, Turkey, and the United States. In fact, India and the US have been signaled as first-time backsliders, manifesting, quote, significant declines in liberal democracy, unquote. Both reports flag populism as a concern. There is irony in the fact that the moment when Indian democracy renounces its exceptionalism and becomes normalized as the mainstream is also the moment when the mainstream is losing its own democratic credentials. It cannot be denied that India manifests many of the characteristics of contemporary populist regimes in the mature democracies. The popular belief in the efficacy of a strong and charismatic leader, the repudiation of liberal democratic norms and values, the antipathy to the mediating institutions of civil society, hostility towards immigrants or those who do not belong to the majority ethnic or racial group, and the characterization of all political opponents as traitors. Populist leaders present themselves as embodiments of the people and mark out the boundaries of who the people are. And contrary to the encompassing sound of this phrase, the people, this is typically an in-group, united by a shared ethnicity, religion, or social class. Those who are different constitute an excluded out-group whose interests implicitly deserve no regard. I will return at the end to suggest that there is a need to think differently about the similarities between Indian and other variants of populism and why Indian exceptionalism may actually be a good thing. But before I do that, let me quickly identify and briefly discuss three major shifts in Indian politics in recent times. This is not comprehensive. These are just three shifts out of a larger bundle of shifts that one could mark. India's party system, first of all, underwent a decisive change in 2014, which brought to office India's first majority government since 1984, and the first non-Congress government to win such a majority since the start of the Indian Republic. The change is even more pronounced now since the BJP's spectacular victory in the general election earlier this year, its complete and incontestable control over the lower house of parliament, and substantial gains also in the upper house with more projected to emerge in months to come. As of today, the BJP is, on its own or in alliance with other parties, in power in as many as 16 states of India, even if some of these victories have been secured at some cost to democracy. The scale of the ruling party's political footprint across the country, not limited as before to the heartland of North India, is a matter of great significance. It signals a return to a one-party dominant political system, which was back in the day had been called the Congress system, when the Indian National Congress was the single dominant party. Since the mid-1980s, India has seen the rise of multiple region and caste-based parties, and since the 1990s, the national polity has witnessed full-term coalition governments formed by the coming together of many of these, sometimes as many as 21, 22, 23 parties, around a central pole represented alternately by the BJP and the Congress. Today, that era of coalition politics, which characterized the Indian political landscape for approximately 25 years, has decisively ended. We are back to one-party hegemony, which finds reflection not just in the institutions of government and parliament, but also in an ideological hegemony that defines what is now called the New India. This ideology seeks to rewrite the foundational political imaginary of India that powered the movement for freedom and found embodiment in the Indian Constitution. And this move from civic nationalism to cultural, or if you like, religious nationalism, is the second major break from the past. The dominant political imaginary of nationalism that provided the foundation of India's constitutional democracy was emphatically civic national in form, civic national hyphenated. This has now been transformed and effectively replaced by a new political imaginary that takes an ethno-religious national form. And it has implications for many things, including the conception of universal and equal citizenship, which is a cornerstone of the Indian Constitution. Recent months have seen attempts to undermine this secular and inclusive conception of citizenship through an ill-conceived national register of citizens, so far limited to one state, and by a proposed amendment to the law on citizenship by naturalization. The effect of these is to introduce religious identity into the law on citizenship, with the mainstreaming of the assumption that Hindus are the natural and normal citizens of India and minorities are somehow lesser citizens. If, as is the declared intent, the National Register of Citizens idea is indeed extended across India, we will effectively have replaced universal equal citizenship with a two-tier citizenship based on religious identity. Simultaneously, a majoritarian doctrine of nationalism, which interprets national identity in terms of the dominant religious identity, has encouraged societal practices of systematically othering citizens belonging to minority communities. This has led not only to the normalization of everyday discrimination, which is a long-standing phenomenon, but has emboldened, and this is a recent phenomenon, emboldened vigilante violence, particularly targeting vulnerable groups like Muslims and Dalits. The spate of lynchings across the country over the last couple of years led the Supreme Court just last year to condemn these as, quote, horrendous acts of mobocracy which cannot be allowed to become the new normal, unquote. It is worrying that these are often acts whose perpetrators go unpunished and on occasion even feted by politicians. So in the short space of a few years, India has traveled quite a long journey from its founding vision of civic nationalism to a new political imaginary of cultural nationalism. As of now, the constitutional fabric remains intact, perhaps just a little frayed and damaged, but the majoritarian nationalism of recent years has certainly lacerated and ruptured the social fabric. There is a legitimate concern that this may be an enduring legacy to the extent that it signals a possibly irreversible damage to India's organically consensual social fabric, in which diverse groups could till recently live together peaceably, even if separately. The importance of social harmony or social cohesion in one form or another is well recognized, all the way from Confucian political philosophy in this part of the world to, let's say, the idea of the overlapping consensus in the political philosophy of John Rawls. And here in Singapore, we heard this morning the minister speaking about shared citizenship in the plural society of Singapore, which has privileged principles of racial and religious harmony. The point is that the presence of social strife in a society, and in India, it would put India's economic achievements and growth potential also at risk, and so that is an additional argument for worrying about it. Finally, there is the question of the infrastructure of democracy, what one might call the essential scaffolding for the architecture of democratic institutions. This includes the cultivation of democratic ideals, the instilling of the democratic virtues of civil and political liberties, of the enjoyment of the rights of free and equal citizenship, of respect for the rule of law. Outside of the electoral framework, which gives expression to the democratic principle of equal representation, the cultivation of democratic values has historically been accomplished by institutions of civil society, the media, and universities. Recall that even the birth of democracy in Eastern Europe in the 1980s was midwifed by these very institutions. Today, wherever populist regimes have secured power, these institutions are under threat. In India, too, they have ceased to function as watchdogs of democracy, as the nurturers of democratic values, and have ceased to provide the thriving ecosystem needed for democratic ideas to be practiced and democratic ideals to be reproduced. Social media, which we've heard a lot about this morning, and the phenomenon of fake news have only served to further vitiate democracy by encouraging a coarsening of the public discourse and, paradoxically, to close rather than to open up spaces. One would imagine the opposite would happen. Close spaces for debate and disagreement between contending points of view. So let me, in conclusion, return to the question of the similarities and differences between variants of populism. Such comparisons are, of course, a matter of legitimate academic interest, but they tend to obfuscate the fact that every country's experience of populist or democratic authoritarian rule, as it is now increasingly called by political scientists, needs to be assessed in the context of its own history. The fact that a decoupling of liberal values and democratic practices has occurred in the mature democracies, and there's lots of literature on this recently, does not make such a decoupling acceptable or legitimate elsewhere. Even less is it a reason to sigh, shrug, and accept it because it is happening in the pedigreed democracies of the global north. For mature democracies, precisely by virtue of that maturity, may be able to reverse these trends and salvage their historically strong democratic traditions stretching back a couple of centuries or so. In these countries, the courts, civil society, the media, and universities continue to assert their independence and offer criticism. In a younger and more fragile democracy, preventing the capitulation of supposedly independent institutions is much harder. Protecting the autonomy of democratic institutions, younger democratic institutions, is more challenging. And upholding the value of liberal democratic ideals next to impossible in an atmosphere rendered toxic by the social media. At this point, one yearns for a little bit of Indian exceptionalism. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Jayal. Now, may I invite the second speaker of the panel, who is going to speak about politics of fear and desire, Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar.
Thank you, and to ISES for having me here again. It's always a pleasure. So, speaking about Pakistan, you don't have to worry too much about democracy, as you know. So I'll get there eventually, but I'm going to take you on a long and circuitous route and talk a little bit about, at least notionally, what in the last year, or at least let's say the last couple of years, has been described sort of as a new politics of change. in Pakistan, centering around Imran Khan and his purportedly new middle class support base. So in both the empirical and intellectual history of modernity, there's arguably no subject more significant and indeed surrounded more by myth than the middle class. In its incarnation as the bourgeoisie of early modern Europe, the middle class is said to have brought the church, divine kingship, and the caste-based social order to its knees, setting the stage for secularism, democracy, and the rule of law. In fact, revisionist scholarship such as that of Vivek Chibber and Pankaj Mishra has demonstrated that the bourgeoisie was far less committed to democracy and equal citizenship than conventional histories of the English, French, and American revolutions would have us believe. The democratization of the Euro-American nation state over time along class, racial, and gender lines took place due to the sustained struggles of working people, racial minorities, and women, and in spite of the resistance of already enfranchised middle-class subjects. In Europe's colonies, the middle-class subject was of course never conceived of as leading the plebeian masses to the promised land of equal citizenship, but instead of sustaining what Partha Chatterjee has called the rule of colonial difference. Or to borrow from yet another theorist of post-colonial politics, Mahmoud Mamdani, to constitute a small minority of citizens, even while the majority of the natives remained subjects, deprived of even a modicum of civil liberties. The most infamous exposition of this idea, as some of you will no doubt be familiar, was offered by the oft-quoted administrator of the British Raj, Thomas Babington Macaulay, in his famous Minute on Education in 1843, when, as was just noted in our previous keynote, he said that the British in India wanted to create a class of Indians who were in color Indian, but in taste and the disposition were very much English. And of course, that class of educated Indians was designed to ensure that, as was pointed out, a few thousand Englishmen could rule over all hundreds of millions of Indians by virtue of the Indians who ruled for them. Now, history has its contingencies, and the British, like the Spanish before them and the French alongside them, would find that it was precisely from within this educated class of Indians that anti-colonial nationalism took root. Yet, as the rise of contemporary populism in South Asia makes ever so clear, the Gandhis, Nehrus, and Jinnahs of the world embodied highly contradictory impulses. The quintessential intellectual of national liberation from European colonialism, Frantz Fanon, warned us more than half a century ago that the native bourgeoisie, what he called the native bourgeoisie, could lead the rest of the newly independent nation to genuine freedom, even freedom of the self that Gandhi famously called Swaraj, or it could do an even more draconian impersonation of its predecessor than the Gora Sahib himself. I wade back into history to establish both what distinguishes the contemporary middle-class moment from the many that have preceded it in colonial and post-colonial South Asia. In Pakistan, of course, the middle class, well, not of course, but in my reading, the middle class motif has animated more dictatorships than democracy. Now, Prime Minister Imran Khan's exhortations against corruption, which is a clear appeal to a relatively educated and upwardly mobile urban audience with middle class aspirations, was preceded as long ago as 1958, when General Ayub Khan first ushered in military rule under the guise of eliminating corruption. Mind you, that was exactly what the motif was then, and indeed the entire political class. The previous keynote mentioned how the steady displacement of the colonial middle class, or perhaps what you would call the elite, by a more vernacular but extremely ruthless political and economic entrepreneur in recent times. I agree about the changes that have taken place in the South Asian polity vis-a-vis the rise of the emergent middle class, but I would suggest that at least in Pakistan's case, and my reading much of the rest of South Asia too, this happened some time ago, at least as early as the 1980s. And it's been driven by substantial socio-economic transformation centered around what Barbara Harris White has called the small town informal economy and the rise of commercial elites, commercial sort of middle classes and so forth. Nawaz Sharif, for instance, Pakistan's now much maligned three-time prime minister, was not part of the colonial middle class, was not English speaking, was very much one of those vernacular commercial sort of emergent elites patronized by the military and now 3 decades into a political career. I think it's important to delve further into the sociology of these new middle classes, a subject that has informed a recent book in the Pakistani context by Amara Maqsood, very suggestively titled The New Pakistani Middle Class. She too concludes that a more vernacular, conservative, and definitively less urbane middle class has emerged to displace its Fanonian predecessor, which of course failed to live up to its pretensions to lead the backward masses into prosperity and freedom as per the promises of the national liberation movement. But that sort of is old hat now. What I want to suggest to you is that we are now entering a new middle class moment. And in this sense, there's two related phenomena that I want to flag. One, and I think this probably applies to much of South Asia, on the one hand is a youth bulge. So more than 65% of Pakistan's population of 220 million is currently below the age of 30. That's maybe 150 million people. On the other hand is the rapid transformation of the public sphere, and especially the field of politics, again, as we've been hearing since the beginning of the session this morning, on account of digital technology. So on the surface, a young, tech-savvy population can be the agent of a progressive transformation of society. However, there are also many potential fallouts to ponder should this emergent young demographic find that its aspirations for upward mobility remain unmet. Imran Khan and the PTI in some way represented this new political subject with all of its aspirations for development and security. The contemporary middle class moment in Pakistan does not, however, appear to be leading to a democratization of the incumbent militarized structure of power, nor helping to redress long-standing ethnic, class, gender, religious, and other divisions in Pakistani society. In fact, an increasingly digitized public sphere is characterized by what I call both a politics of fear and desire, reinforcing state militarism, i.e. the hegemonic power of the army, and exacerbating neoliberalized models of development at great social and ecological cost. So let me just sort of suggest to you what I mean by this middle class aspiration. The aspiration that I'm referring to means both an unwillingness to accept, as again has been noted, especially in the keynote, the patronage-based political inheritance centered around established parties, in Pakistan's case over the last 30 years would be the PMLN and the PPP, replete their family dynasties. And this initially, actually interestingly, the chairperson noted in his introduction to the session, this sort of rejectionism amongst a young, tech-savvy sort of population actually started, at least in the PTI's case, from within the diaspora. Maybe some of you sitting here, which continues to form a huge support base of Imran Khan and the PTI. It was noted, right, that Prime Minister Modi is about to go to Houston and presumably will address a huge diaspora population. So that was, of course, Prime Minister Imran Khan's first stop when he visited America recently. So it was like an election jalsa, but in Washington, D.C. And it might be worth remembering that this diasporic population, at least of Pakistanis, again, upwardly mobile, middle class, was very supportive, at least initially, of Pervez Musharraf's military regime as well. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that this is not a new phenomenon per se. This has happened time and again, that sort of a rhetoric of cleaning up the corrupt political class solving all of Pakistan's problems has happened time again. And in this, the charismatic messiah, can emerge in the form of a uniformed dictator or a cricket World Cup winning captain. That can change, but the motif itself has happened time and again. Now, this emergent demographic, this young, tech-savvy population, is attuned to the global marketplace of ideas and commodities, and of course wants to share itself. Gated communities, online entertainment ever available for purchase, sort of a globalized Indian Premier League, with its tens of millions of TV consuming its audience. Now, whether or not everyone who engages in window shopping actually has the means to buy the middle class lifestyle is another matter altogether. The point is the aspiration rather than its actualization per se. A point of note, by very liberal estimates, Pakistan's middle class is in any case now 60 million strong. Again, this is not to suggest that everyone in this bracket is beyond precarious sort of livelihood or may not fall back down into the subordinate rungs below, but just to indicate, similar to the figures, the sort of the mythical middle class in India, let's say 300 million or 400 million, or, it can vary. But the point is to indicate that this middle class subject is now increasingly a median strata of society, at least in terms of aspiration, and quite distinct in that sense from a relatively small old colonial middle class, which I think is what also was pointed out with the Sri Lankan case. So if on the one hand the middle class aspiration is constituted by a politics of desire that conforms to the glitz and glamour of the increasingly digitized and globalized world in which we live, it is dialectically conjoined to a politics of fear. This is the fear of the unknown other, which in the post-9/11 world is increasingly a nebulous force known as global terrorism. Sometimes it takes the name of Al-Qaeda. Remember, there was an Al-Qaeda once. More recently, ISIS, and then there are its various local offshoots, Boko Haram, the Jamaat-e-Islami in Indonesia and Malaysia, the Taliban, etc., etc. The other means that it takes whatever form it needs to do so as to galvanize the captive TV-watching public, replete its middle-class aspirations in the form of a narrow identity politics. So the middle-class desire for consumption and worldliness is counterposed through the anti-civilizational terror of the other. It could be in the form of a Hindutva, it could be Trump and Boris Johnson, railing against immigrants. There are all sorts, as was pointed out, in terms of the contemporary populist moment. In Pakistan, this translates into a combination of handing over more and more power to the coercive state apparatus, i.e. the army, blaming corrupt politicians for all of our woes, and searching for a new charismatic messiah, the cricket World Cup winning captain. And all so that our desires for a middle-class life can be fulfilled. In the form of Imran Khan, it also gives rise to all sorts of contradictions. He can cater to conservatives and liberals alike, all who are brought together by their desire for respectable middle-class lives. He can, one at the same time, be anti-American, anti-West, and yet be eulogized sort of within and secretly for his exploits in taming the gorgeous daughter of a British Jewish scion. He is a populist par excellence, capable of taking on multiple identities, all of which reflect some deep-seated repressed desire of his followers to become him. And of course, he can also appeal to the old colonial types too, with his Aitchisonian and Oxford background. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that when you add a politics of fear to a politics of desire, you create this, as was pointed out, a rather toxic mix. And what you get is actually not all that different, despite the desires for transformation and change. But then the politics of change, as we now know 12 months later, quite quickly disintegrates into yet more disillusionment and a recognition that this was not change at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Akhtar. Thank you for that presentation. May I now invite Professor Amena Mohsin, who's going to speak about the rise of the sacred in South Asia. She's from Dhaka.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the ISS for inviting me. I have a fairly detailed PowerPoint presentation, which you can see it on the screen. But for the paucity of time, maybe I'll just go to the major points. Thank you very much. You know, though the title of my paper is the Rise of the Sacred in South Asia, I'll be focusing on the Bangladesh context, but I think what I'll be talking about is applicable for the rest of South Asia as well. I start my presentation with a quote from, or I would like to bring in Partha Chatterjee over here. Partha Chatterjee, while talking about the partition of India, while talking of Bengal, he made one point which I think is true for today's South Asia or post-colonial South Asia as well, where he mentioned that when the peasant, he draws a distinction or a line between the world of peasant politics and the world of the elite politics, and he argues that where there is this domain where the peasants have an informal political system. I mean, for lack of better word, I'm saying it's a system, but there is this world of informal politics, and there is this world of formal politics. And when the peasant makes the entry into the world of formal politics, charismatic leadership and religion plays a very critical role. And I'm saying this because nationalism, which supposedly are modernizing mantras, they have acquired new dimensions, demonstrating the limits of Western models of nationhood and secularism. Nationalism in the post-colonial societies had come as a reactionary force, hence primordiality rather than civic ties constituted strong basis of this nationalism, of which religion is an important variable. I think I take a different perspective from our Indian scholar over here. And since I'm talking, Bangladesh phase 2, if I may say, that colonialisms, one from the British and then Pakistan. So religion had been a recurring theme in Bangladesh politics, and civic primordial nationalism had been a dominant theme in our context. That's why I'm making this point. And also, if one, I would like to bring in Ernest Gallen over here, who emphasized us on the role of modernity and argues that an agrarian society does not need nationalism. It's only an industrial society which needs nationalism. The binaries are very stark over here, but then one can't deny that post-colonial South Asia failed to move beyond the exclusions of nationalism. And again, as Ashish Nande has said, that these South Asia, in the context of South Asia, that these were all societies turned into nations. And the forces of globalization, they also problematized the thing further. And for secularization, religion, it sees religion as a problem for modernity, which again brings in religion to the fore and in the public sphere. And as I said, that I'll be talking about Bangladesh, but this can be applied in the rest of South Asia as well. In the context of South Asia, Bangladesh, I bring in state-instituted secularism. The constitution of Bangladesh, it inserted, the next slide please. It inserted secularism as one of the state principles of Bangladesh. But when translated into Bangla, it was dharmo-nirapekkhota. That created a kind of a problem, because dharmo-nirapekkhota means neutrality about religion, and which the masses could or the politicians could manipulate it into something that one can't be neutral about religion. And but if one looks into the kind of secularism that Bangladesh instituted, was different from the Western notion of secularism, and Bangladesh did provide the space for equality of all religions. So this created a space of which I argue for the politicians to manipulate the concept of secularism itself. Then, if you can move to the next here. Then what I term is the nationalization of religion. As I say that, you know, the insertion of secularism and created a space for politicians to manipulate the concept of secularism, that nationalization of religion. And here I go into details that how, you know, religion, after the assassination of the father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, after 1975, the military and the quasi-military rulers of Bangladesh, they dropped secularism from the constitution. They removed the ban on the participation of communal political parties. The constitution was Islamized, and Islam was also really, you know, declared as one of the state, as the state religions state religion of Bangladesh. And the military rulers, I mean, they did it obviously to consolidate their power base. But this institutionalized religion into the political realm of our political landscape of Bangladesh. And after 1991, we find that civil rule was established. Bangladesh follows a Westminster model of democracy, which is the majority in any democracy. So what happened that it became a part of the political culture, if you can read it in the you know, PowerPoints. After 1991, we found that the political landscape had changed, and all the political parties, they made liberal use of religion, both in their political speeches as well as in the symbols. It was very apparent that religion had become a part of kind of political landscape of Bangladesh. And both the major mainstream political parties, they accommodated the Islamist forces or Islamic political parties in one way or others. And all the political, if we look at the political posters, if we look at the attire of the political leaders, there was a visible change. At the then I go on to what I term as the contestation for the soul of Bangladesh. This happened fairly recently in 2013, when in the wake of the trial of the war criminals, we found that in Shahbag, I mean, this is a very well-publicized thing, event that happened in Bangladesh in 2013, what is also popularly known as the Ganojagaran Moncho. There was this contestation between the secularists and the Islamists. And the people at particularly what we call the youth, they were protesting the verdict given by the ICT to one of the alleged war criminals, Qadir Mullah, and they were calling for the revival of Bengali identity. And but the problem began because, you know, it was not only about, it was a very complicated thing. I mean, the slogans that were given over there, they were chanting slogans like Phashi Chhara Raini. I mean, they were demanding that there should be death by hanging. And also, there was a kind of a revival of the Bengali nationalism where they were constantly talking about Tumike, Amitke, you know, who are you, who am I? We are all Bengalis. So it kind of excluded the non-Bengali population out of it. But it was kind of an appeal to the spirit of 1971. And what I forgot to mention earlier, that in the post-1975 area, when the military took over power, they also shifted from Bengali nationalism to Bangladeshi nationalism, which had its religion embedded in it as a part of Bangladeshi nationalism, which was not there earlier. As I had said that earlier, secularism was part of Bangladesh constitution, and Bengali nationalism was the main, was the core of Bengal's nationalism, and that was the founding principle for Bangladesh's liberation movement. But to counter this, another force which projected itself as an Islamist force and called itself Hifazat-e-Islam, they emerged. And their slogans again was they projected Islam to be the soul of Bangladesh. And one can see that there were distinct class dimensions to it, in the sense that Islam, the Hifazat were, these were predominantly madrasa students, and they projected that Shabak is being dominated by the atheists, and Islam was in danger. So the contestation brought forth the tensions between the modernist seculars and the primordial religious, which in an otherwise very religiously tolerant society. And it also deepened the gender question in Bangladesh politics and society. For the first time, the country found itself divided along Astik, which means the believer, and Nastik, which means the non-believer divide. And the politics of labeling, which is, the country was divided between, in a sense, the pro-liberation and the anti-liberation forces. That is how it was projected. I'm not saying that it was actually divided. I mean, these were the projections, and what could see a reflection of this in the media as well as social media. Then I talk about how the making of the sacred, from how the social landscape also changed. Because one sees in this, when I talk about the rise of the sacred, I also mentioned that it was not only done from the top, but also from the below. As politics changed, what happened, that the society also began to change, and one sees the emergence of these vast mahfils. And the vast mahfils, in these vast mahfils, which are usually religious congregations, but one could see that they made very derogatory remarks about women. And I have detailed those out in the PowerPoint, and also about university education. But what is encouraging is that the government is taking note of it. And then the Hifazat-e-Islam also emerged as a very strong force in this context. And also, what is also disturbing is that textbooks are being changed because of the demand of Islam, of the Hifazat-e-Islam. And the textbooks are changed at the school level. And if you look at how knowledge is being produced, the demands which Hifazat is making are quite, they think that the textbooks, the present textbooks they create are anti-Islamic, and these are very gendered. And finally, what is happening is that one finds in my concluding remarks, I'm arguing that the rise of religio-nationalism, somehow it is replacing the ethno-nationalism, which is one of the major founding principles of nationalism, and the rise of orthodox and a singular understanding of Islam, and also a very gendered kind of a society where patriarchy, or what one can call hypermasculinity or toxic masculinity, it is taking over, shrinking spaces for civil society, rise of populism, and I think majoritarian electoral democracy is one of the major reasons for it, because political parties have to cater to the majority of the population, and in a society where more than 86% of the population is Muslim, and once you change the character of the state, once you change the constitution, it is very difficult for any political party to reverse back. Though secularism has been inserted back into the constitution, but Islam continues to be the state religion of Bangladesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mohsin. Now I'll invite Dr. Harinda Vidanage from Colombo.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Niraja Mohan, ISS, for having me. And I was observing the lineup in the morning and looking at the three guys who spoke, representing South Asia, all have, defied the hair. So, it's a very disruptive set of, we are very, in that way, quite, we love the disruption in that particular today. If you sneak in Ambassador Shivashankar Menon also, who's going to speak to us, so 4 guys in South Asia who love this trend. Anyway, to go into a more serious conversation, I have my slides running while I speak. So I focus on politics in changing South Asia and focusing on Sri Lanka. And I want to focus a little bit on the regional global changes as well, which is affecting Sri Lanka as well as most of the other countries in South Asia. So my focus, given the time limitation, is on the 21st century and specifically the 2 decades that passed in the 20th century. So from 2000 to 2009, I mean, this is a time period, I think, not just in Sri Lanka, there were significant shifts globally, regionally, as well as in Sri Lanka. But for me, the specific focus of the presentation is on the last 10 years, because I see from both living in and outside of Sri Lanka in that particular time frame, the serious, unprecedented transformations the country has gone through. And those transformations are reflections of the globally induced shocks as well as the endogenous shocks that the country has experienced. So as a mix of that, a synergy of that has created significant and serious and sometimes very concerning shifts in the political landscape of this country. So if you look at the Sri Lankan narrative, what have we been talking about in Sri Lanka since the 2010? I take 2010 as, as the post-conflict, the post-war era, and the last 10 years, because Sri Lanka, we just marked the end of the war, 10 years, the so-called anniversary. So the first trend, the first theme that came up politically, which was very powerful, which was significant, was the fact that the state and the government was forced to speak on the theme of reconciliation and reconstruction. The fact that there was massive devastation physically as well as significant shocks on communities, given the fact, especially in the last couple of years of the conflict. So reconciliation was mandatory. It was a key prime policy pillar that had to be absorbed by the government at that time and governments afterwards. And reconstruction was the second part of it. That was one. Then we were also going through a significant shift in identity. Because Sri Lanka, unlike India or the other countries in the region, if you talk to a Sri Lankan, who is a Sri Lankan? Do we have an idea of Sri Lanka? We don't have an idea of Sri Lanka. We have a set of values, ideas that we think make a Sri Lankan. So if I talk to a Sinhala Buddhist, we always talk about the Sinhala Buddhist Lanka. Because though we kind of it's totally different from the Singaporean experience. If you talk to a Sri Lankan or a Sinhalese Buddhist Sri Lankan, it's Sinhala Buddhist country. That's what we call it, right? It's organic in our narrative. It's not like forced, it's organic in our narrative. So that makes it very hard. So it makes it very hard for most majority of Sinhalese to kind of go for that idea of the state. I mean, we all say, yes, we accept the idea of multilateralism, multiculturalism, but there is a particular line which is a subconscious which is built in, which is a big challenge for politicians, politics as well as moving forward. That we had this new idea about Sri Lanka. Because the last 10 years, we saw the regional shifts, the global shifts about the idea of the importance of the Indian Ocean and now the Indo-Pacific, the strategic constructions that came up. And that since the end of the conflict, Sri Lanka's regional arc has been trying to absorb and be part of these changes. So we always try to say, because of our strategic location, the geopolitical mantra, we have to play a key role. We have to be this idea, we have to create this Indian Ocean identity. But I still don't know how far we are successful internally about telling people we are building this Indian Ocean identity. It is good for us, it is good for our prosperity, it is good for our futures, because we are a maritime nation. But that has been the kind of idea we have been trying to kind of focus on, but it has been extremely articulated through the geopolitical compulsions that we faced in the last 10 years. It's very clear we are going through a phase where there is serious geopolitical compulsions. There is a significant vacuum because of the rollback of the global hegemon. So there is clearly a tussle in the Indian Ocean. It's been articulated in different ways. There will be people will say we have to embrace it, we have to be part of it, we have to take a side. There's that kind of conversation in Sri Lanka. But that has really shaped the way we have kind of gone through our identity and also our politics, right? Because there is significant militarization of the region that we are living in, and in a few years it will be one of the most militarized as well as the weaponized regions. So for example, if my country's politicians are thinking of going green, that's bad. Because that's a simple example I want to give you. I just spoke at a conference on sustainable development a few days back, and we were celebrating how good we have been about going green. This is an example of that. But I said, if we are in a geopolitical tension, if we are seeing a militarized region, the militaries are the worst polluters in the world. Right? There is no green military in the world, right? So because how do you then think of articulating an internal policy about going green? A simple example like that. The third point, this is in the last 10 years, which came out around 2014, 2015 in Sri Lanka, was the fact that are we heading towards authoritarianism? Has the leaders who won the war have become kings and become gods? Are they creating a state which is a state of is it going to be a new postmodern kingdom? So isn't it bad? That's where we had the resistance coming from the internal body politics saying we need good governance. And the 2015 election was the turning point of that particular conversation. To a certain extent, and especially for the geopolitical West, it's been celebrated as a return of democracy, return of liberalism, the win for the liberal bloc, where Sri Lankans managed to democratically overthrow the government which was seen as authoritarian and bring in a government that was more liberal and more democratic. Then finally, a few years into that administration, if you speak to people now in Sri Lanka, there's significant rejection of that idea. The idea of good governance that we all banked on. It's like the war on terror, right? Everybody banked on war on terror, but that's a concept. The tangible aspects we never saw coming. We never knew how it's going to articulate. Like that, when you throw an idea of good governance and then totally fail on it, that's a big crisis. Because people expected a lot of values that would materialize under the idea of a good governance. So the failure of that and the return of people's yearning. Now, if you talk to a Sri Lankan, what do you want? Stability. We need stability. We need strong leadership. So we have somehow gone back to the discourse before 2015. The idea that a strong leadership, strong government, in authoritarian in its make and shape, still will be better. So it's kind of that scenario Sri Lanka is living in, which is kind of a concerning factor. I mean, if you're an academic, as for academics, it's really, people are really worried because that's kind of the drift we are moving into. But I want to kind of focus on a few ideas that kind of, have come with that. So let me kind of dwell on that. Why have we come to that conjuncture? Why is Sri Lanka at this particular point? because this idea of one of the major challenges that Sri Lanka encounters was at the end of the war, there was this serious discussion about nation building. Right? We even have a nation building tax. Right? So that means the people of the country had to contribute. But the problem was the leadership contributing in the nation building? Was nation building just building of infrastructures? Right? So the answer between 2010 and 2015 was this serious focus on tangible benefits that the government was going to give to the people, and it came in the form of more of an infrastructure heavy promise. Right? And then we went into a post-material shift in 2015, saying, no, we need things like values, democracy, liberalism. But what we have come back to is the fact that the country needs serious leadership. So we are not even talking about systems here. That's my worry. All the presenters, all the keynote, everybody talked about institutions, value systems. No, if you talk to Sri Lankans now, average Sri Lankan, they're looking for a leadership. They're looking for leaders, which is a big challenge. Because what Sri Lanka is seeing as a part of the shifts in the region as well as the world, you see Trumps, you see Modis, right? So what you see are leaders. Irrespective of how we see them, they see leaders. Some of them are disruptors, some of them are delivering, some of them are changing. For example, Prime Minister Modi is sort of saying, articulating what he really wants. I'm not saying when President Xi Jinping is articulating a new China. So that's where people are drawing inspirations from. Irrespective of our academic lenses, we have to understand the pulses, the fact that how people are viewing things. So the demand for a leader is very much now articulated in the political psyche of this country, which will seriously have effects on how Sri Lanka is going to be shaped. My last point, because of we are running out of time, is how much technology has contributed, especially I call this cyber politics, right? The last 5 years, we have seen Sri Lanka's political narrative based on the conversation that I just brought out been totally shifted because of the use of social media platforms as well as how people have mastered cyber tech. I call it cyber political efforts. Even in the first speech we had today from the minister, she spoke about regulations, about the challenge Singapore faced. This is the point we are not getting. What technology has done, what cyberspace has done, is kind of created the natural state of nature. It has created spaces for people to be tribal, people to be as bad as anyone they can be. And also the fact that people have embraced two things: post-fact and post-truth. So that is a challenge for most of us, policymakers as well as academics. And especially in a time we are living in now, the fake news, disinformation, all these things come under this banner. People don't care about the truth anymore. That's one of the biggest challenges we will face in the future, right? The minister said we have to put the fact out. But the question is, do the people want to hear facts, the truth? That is why university systems are in crisis. That is why the academic notions of reality, the idea of truth as sacrosanct is in crisis. But then it gives a huge opportunity to populists, extremists, to create a narrative which is seemingly right and which is seemingly true. This is why populism, nationalism, extremism is thriving in cyberspace. Why? Because they are creating the narrative, they have the power. That's why I say it's like state of nature. In the Hobbesian state of nature, whoever had power thrived. In cyberspace, whoever has power to create a narrative, whether it is right or wrong, whether it is true or not, has the power to thrive. This is why states are struggling to face the realities of cyber political change. That is why we are trying to block the internet, create regulation, but that is why it's not working. We have advanced as states, we have totally misunderstood what cyberspace has created. Even I don't think the creator of cyberspace, the creators who anticipated this coming. But I'm not talking about anarchy per se, but I'm talking about a new qualitatively different space where politics can happen, where the space can influence politics. That is why you have terms like weaponized narratives. Rand is coming out with a concept called truth decay. We have the idea of misinformation, fake news. But if you look at everything, it boils down to this fact. Why are they politically relevant? They are politically relevant because we have entered this kind of, re-entered the post-factual, post-truth time. And in countries like Sri Lanka, which is struggling to articulate its own identity, struggling to look at its political futures, this disinformation, this post-truth will have significant political power. So if you can convince people in Sri Lanka saying, you can be the best leader, you can provide security, because in Sri Lanka, quintessential security has become the quintessential public good people are seeking. So this is the future that I'm very worried about, concerned about, but this is the future that we have to engage with in Sri Lanka. So, well, I mean, the time is quite not on our side, but thank you so much again. We can have a conversation in the Q&A. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Vidanage. As you would agree with me that all the 4 speakers have been absolutely disciplined and have said so much in 15 minutes each. But we only have 15 minutes left for one set of questions because the audience has been very patient, very attentive. But we are into lunchtime. Singapore lunchtime is at noon and we are at 1. So let's not test the patience of the audience. So I'll take 3 questions and I'll start with Dr. Mahdi.
Thank you, Chairman. I congratulate you on putting together such a fascinating set of speakers from the 4 corners of South Asia. Thank you so much. My question is directed at Professor Jayal on India. You spoke about the new political imaginary. There's a transition from civic nationalism to cultural nationalism. And I think this is of great concern to a lot of people in the Indian diaspora as well, because in one way or another, many of us are still connected to India, but it's an India that's not a Hindu India, but a secular India. Perhaps it's not a Hindi India, but a multilingual India. My question to you is this: has India turned the corner? And if it has, is it an irreversible direction? Or do you have any hopes in the next, maybe after 2 elections, things will be different? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, yes, please, ma'am. Yeah, if you can just stand up.
My question is to Professor Jayal. My name is Malini and I come from Azim Premji University in India. I thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. I have 3 quick questions.
No, just one, please. No, look.
Okay.
We just, as I said, we are
Okay,
running
just one.
into lunch.
All
Just
right.
one, yeah.
With regard to the distinction that you seem to be making between liberal democracy and maybe a procedural democracy, my question to you is, have we been misled into thinking by political theory that there is something absolutely divine about liberal democracy? Because if you look at the world around you, leave alone South Asia, every liberal democracy seems to be accompanied by violence. So is there something endemic within liberal democracy that makes way for anti-minority propaganda and violence? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, please. I hope don't let India monopolize this conversation. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Samia Haq. I'm here from Bangladesh, from Dhaka. I had a question for Dr. Aasim. Thank you for your very good talk. My quick question was, well, a comment before the question, that the politics of fear dispelling politics of desire and aspiration seems to be a theme that's running through the region, if not the world. Within the context of Pakistan, how do you see, what kind of agentive force do you give to the middle classes as their aspirations are being dispelled or sidetracked or marginalized? And what are the cultural reserves that you think they have at their disposal to fall back on if they are to keep some aspirations alive?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's one hand I saw. This is the last question. Sir, please. Very briefly now, we are really running into time.
Good morning, the panel. I'm Ron Tan from private sector, environmental industry. This question is addressed to the last speaker. He mentioned about the use of diesel in the military operation around the world. So what is the solution that you can offer to cut down the use of diesel as one of the main pollutants, or not only in India and in Sri Lanka, but all over the world? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll start from this end. I think, Harinda, you want to start? Just answer.
Yeah, I didn't think, I didn't, what I mentioned was, I'm not an energy expert, so I don't have, but I'll bring it out, the fact that how military is, the return of geopolitics and militarization in the world, how it is really pushing the use of fossil fuel, and it is having a serious impact on the global governance agenda, such as the 2030. So I don't know if there is a solution, because as far as I know, no military wants to go green, because you don't want a green tank or a green jet which can't fly faster than your rival. So that's a challenge we are facing, between the civilian sector versus the military sector. If you are a political leader, what kind of, how are you going to articulate your position on green, the whole global governance versus your national interest? If somebody says, no, we need to invest on more militaries. That was the juxtaposition I was trying to bring. I'm sorry, I don't have a kind of a response to that, but I was trying to bring out the sorry state of the reality, given the shift that's happening in the world at the moment. It's a 21st century reality which I want to highlight on. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mohsin, would you like to add any final thoughts based on the discussion? Not in response to the question, but if you have anything to add to what you said earlier.
All I wanted to say is that I think that this is to Malini's question, what she raised about India. I think I do believe that there is something embedded in what we call liberal democracy. That liberal democracy is not, whether the societies were ready to accept these liberal democracies. That's why I quoted Nandi, that these were societies, and very quickly we try to turn them into nations. And all over South Asia, we found that ethnic nationalism or primordial nationalism was something that remained a very strong factor in politics, and religion as well as culture. Because culture, like South Asians see religion as part of their culture. So they, from the top, the political leaders were able to exploit this or manipulate this. So that illiberalism was something that came out. So it was embedded in the way that we adopted it. Thank you.
Dr. Akhtar?
Okay, so, I think that when we talk about the middle class, of course, there's lots of things that one couldn't say here. The middle class, of course, is fractured along many lines as well. For me, most prominently, ethnically. When people talk about Pakistan, they often say, oh, it's Muslims and Islam and so on and so forth. But really, there's a lot of fragmentation along ethnic lines as well. So there are other forms of politics which are more expansive and more democratic. And I think what I was trying to say with this particular middle class aspiration is that it's very individuated. It's very much like, the idea, it's sort of like I was saying last night to my father, in fact, it's like the Americanization of the world, right? It's like the American dream. So everybody sort of perceives themselves to possibly be able to climb up the ladder and make it to the top. But of course, still 25% of America's population lives below the poverty line, right? So in some ways, the American dream is never going to be fully realized. So that then produces different kinds of responses. So there can be a mobilization along ethnic lines. Unfortunately, there's no mobilization that still creates, that produces some kind of perhaps universal ethic or universal that then can bring society. I was listening to the other speakers too, and I think that partly, I'm struggling to come to terms with the idea that there is something like, a people of a country. There are different groups in a country, there are classes and so on and so forth. And what I'm trying to say is that the middle class aspiration finds it difficult to think beyond itself. So if there's 60 million Pakistanis who are middle class, that means there's still, 108, 160 that are not, who would like to be but are not. And there's no politics that represents them. And in some ways, that's what I was saying about the various middle class moments, right? At some point it was like, we are all a nation, but we never became a nation. We are all tired of corruption and let's support a dictator. I mean, I think Pakistan is also an outlier here, right? Because we can't say, oh, liberal democracy has produced this. Because we've spent half of our history trying to actually establish even sort of the formal liberal democratic institutions. So I agree that there's a crisis of representation in general, and then there's a question of whether there's sort of a society-wide vision to create an egalitarian society, an ecologically sustainable society, and I don't see it as of now. Perhaps it's also from within the middle class that could emerge, but as we are all sort of suggesting, in some ways, that the trend is towards populism and towards sort of superficial sort of so-called solutions, which then just reinforce the problem. So I think the question is, how then do you create that imaginary that does sort of address structural issues, and I'm not sure that I have an answer, except that at the very least to pose that this is something that's required, and then to think through what the potential answers could look like.
Thank you for those questions. Your questions are on the concerns of the diaspora about this shift. Another diaspora, a very large diaspora, has actually been very supportive of this shift and has in fact propelled it forward. That has been a sort of significant contribution of the Indian diaspora in the West, certainly. It is a matter of concern. Is it irreversible? I don't know, obviously, but I would just say that there's two kinds of senses in which we might think of reversibility. So I'm a sort of a pessimist by temperament. I'm like Raja here, who started in his opening remarks, he signaled optimism about this. So I think there are two kinds of reversibility. One is institutional health. Can that be recovered, restored, rescued, salvaged, etc.? There I have less hope. The other is resilience, which is, one might call it civilizational. And one might say that a civilization which is several thousand years old, which has traditions of people living with their differences separately and yet together, might be a resilient legacy that could help to reverse these trends. So I don't know, between the sort of modern institutional reversibility, or in that sense, I'm less optimistic. But on the civilizational front, I would be a little more optimistic. However, I mean, I'm not an astrologer, so who can say? Malini's question is extremely, in fact, nested inside it are multiple questions already. But let me have a go at one or two questions that I'm reading in what you said. So at least two. You talked about procedural democracy and about whether liberalism had misled us liberal political theorists had misled us, etc. Look, democracy is everywhere a work in progress, and different societies, I think, create different types of democracies. There is no one model anywhere. And yes, it is true that we were reasonably successful in institutionalizing procedural democracy, formal institutions of democracy. Whether we were equally successful in bringing in what one calls substantive democracy is another matter. And this is something that goes back to something that Dr. Ambedkar said at the conclusion of the Constituent Assembly's deliberations about whether political democracy would ever be complete without economic and social democracy. So the topsoil of political democracy, he feared, would not be able to sustain us, and to some extent, that fear has been proved right, because economic and social democracy are still works in progress, if at all. However, we cannot forget the fact even if we think about liberalism as an alien political philosophy, we cannot forget the fact that through the 70s and the 80s, we have seen popular social movements, right? Whether these were working class movements, whether these were environmental movements, whether there were other movements for social justice, people's movements of various kinds, including, in fact, I mean, the movement for civil liberties, which got an impetus after the emergency in that period. So there have been social movements which have been animated by liberal ideals of rights and justice. So one might call it liberalism, one might call it Enlightenment values, which are, of course, provincial in their origins, but they do undergo a change everywhere. I mean, liberalism of the 18th century was extremely hospitable to the idea of empire, but we know that the critique of empire also emerged from within that same liberal ecosystem, right? So, I mean, liberalism also changes, not just in different societies and different contexts, but also over time in the very areas where it originated. So it's a complex question, but you know, I'll stop there. Thanks.
I think we're almost on time, so before I call the MC to come and bring this to a close, I just had a couple of thoughts. One, I think all of you agree that we had a lot of pessimism, which is seems in tune with the times that we're seeing. I mean, the globalization seems to be collapsing, something we believed was going to be irreversible, and that is being reversed. We talked about now the political theory about how democracies die. If they don't die, we said now we are told the technologies will kill them. So that is another latest theory that we've seen. We've seen self-loathing across the world at the climate barbarism that the humankind as a whole, I mean, that's a new phrase that has come into being, that whether it's the haze here, whether it is, you just had to land in Delhi to see what the urban pollution in India, or the Brazilian Amazon forest fires. So I think across the board, I think on all aspects, we seems to be in a mode of general pessimism. But I think as Niraja said, look, we also have to be optimistic, because I believe politics in the end will represent human agency, and human agency is one that overcomes the kind of challenges it has done before, and I don't think it's right for us to write off. I think that's where the question Arun asked, I mean, is it irreversible? I think if we knew the answer, I mean, none of us would know the answer, but what we do know as a general principle is that people have resisted this kind of an imposition, and that every turn has a contradictions built into it. If you use the dialectical was the word you used, I mean, everything produces its own contradiction. So therefore, I think we got to be more hopeful, but I think it's not faith-based optimism. But I think South Asia, I think one of the jobs of ISAS is to keep up that analysis of politics, because this is not the last word. This is just it captured, I think, a difficult moment in the evolution of South Asia. But we've seen the subcontinent overcome civil wars, we've seen it overcome all kinds of things. So the story doesn't end here, the history doesn't end here. And I think the job of all of us as analysts is to continue to see where this process goes on. But one thought, I mean, Dr. Gauhar Rizvi, I don't know how many of you have heard of him, is the advisor to the Bangladesh government. He wrote something about a decade ago, that when he was a graduate student in the United States in the 1980s, early 1980s, the departments of Indian and South Asian studies, essentially the faculty said, look, it is safe to be pessimistic about South Asia. That's a case of triage, overpopulation, underdevelopment, political incompetence, the chaos, the anarchy, that you can't go wrong if you're pessimist about South Asia or India in general. But that has remarkably changed in the last 10 years, that South Asia there been huge set of optimistic trends. That's fairly recent actually. So it's not, pessimism certainly is very new, but optimism too has been relatively new. So I think history takes its turns, and I think the challenge for us at ISAS and as we look ahead is to continue to track the processes and the contradictions within them and to see where it takes us, because I think East Asia, as I said in the beginning, Southeast Asia, stakes of this region in the subcontinent are only going to grow, because the weight of South Asia, the salience of South Asia is going to rise. We have Ambassador Menon who's going to talk about the geopolitics of it at lunch. and I'm not going to detain you anymore. So please join me in thanking our 4 panelists for bringing such an excellent analysis. And one final thought, for all the pessimism, the quality of analysis should give you the hope that actually that we can find answers to the challenges that confront South Asia.
Thank you, distinguished panelists and Professor Mohan. Ladies and gentlemen, our next session will take place over lunch. We would appreciate if you could get your food and quickly return to the ballroom for the address, which will start in the next 15 minutes.